All right. So, what to do in bad markets? So I was doing this presentation. I like looked up what folks were saying on the forum, since that's I think what a lot of folks had started out on. I think the common answer that I got from most people was, um, reading your IPS, and then sipping your coffee, and really not doing very much. And I think that's what a lot of people said in response to a couple threads on the forum talking about this. Um, when I like looked a little further, there were definitely some more like nuanced things that folks did talk about, and that I definitely had thought about. We'll kind of go through them sort of one by one, the different options. Um, I think the thing I saw the most probably was tax loss harvesting. And then also other things like increasing emergency fund, reducing 401k distributions. There was a lot on rebalancing also, and how or when or what should determine that. And so I think we can kind of go through these different options about things that, practical things that people might do during this time. With the caveat that I think a lot of people, like I mentioned, did say really just doing nothing and not to really change your investing strategy, given the fact that it's just a bad market. There were some other kind of options that folks had mentioned that did seem to be a little more questionable, but might be applicable in certain situations. Some things included like changing your IPS or selling things to invest in the market, converting from IRA to Roths, and switching like from equities to equities from cash or bond positions. And then no one mentioned this on our forums, but bad options would obviously be selling stocks that aren't doing well. And this is talked probably at length about on the forum. So in general, the value of staying the course, and this is probably like one of the central like Boglehead philosophy tenets. And I think that's one thing that's always been emphasized in the books I've read and on the forum as well. There's always a chance that stocks will rise or fall in the future. Folks have pointed out, you don't really know how good that chance is, and you can't really predict the future in terms of that. The other thing is, it's hard to know when exactly to sell or buy the stocks. And you don't really know if the market's going to rise or fall further, and it's hard to decide that. And I can sort of speak from personal experience. I tried to time the market, and it's very difficult. You don't know really. When you sell a stock, you don't know could it rise higher? You really have no idea. And same thing with buying stocks. You might buy them right now, but it might drop further in the future. And so I think that's where staying the course and really sticking to your IPS sometimes is a better decision. The other thing is, are you really going to be able to outpredict folks who have more knowledge and access to information than you do? And I think we'd all like to think we have that ability, but I think the reality is most of us don't, and most of us don't have the time to really invest or spend in learning all these things. So I think that's another reason to really stay the course. And this is from one of Rick Ferry's analysis and looking at index fund portfolios, and one that's been talked about a lot in the forum. Essentially it's showing that you're looking here at the major index stocks for U.S. equities, international equities, U.S. bonds, and a weighted composition of those. And what you're seeing is, in a large majority of the cases, for different types of funds, you can see the breakdown. The index portfolio is beating a lot of the privately managed portfolios that are done by investment advisors, and in a significant percentage of the time too. Over 80%. Obviously, this isn't 100%. So there are some people who are outperforming, the index funds, but our ability to know who that is or who is going to outperform is pretty limited. And we as like folks who don't know as much won't be able to predict that. And as I was mentioning before, the value of staying the course is it is hard to really know like what's going to lead to increases or decreases in the market, and sometimes it doesn't make so much sense, and sometimes it does. Like if you look at the first red circle, in the top left there, that is a point where stocks were making an all-time high, and someone at that point might think, oh, it's a great time to sell. Buy low, sell high. But if you look at the market as it continues down, it keeps continuing to rise, and so that may not have been the best time to buy low and sell high because the market was going higher. Another thing, you see here, like the Star Wars: The Force Awakens was released, at that time, and then the market crashed. Was that what caused that? No, but we really have a limited ability to sort of predict what might lead to increase or decrease in the market, or when the peaks are. Another thing, you notice from this graph, and I think when you look at the overall change in the stock market overall, is it increases over the long term. And so that's another reason that, we may not be able to pick the winning numbers, but we do know that overall it'll increase. And that's another important reason why index funds really are kind of the way to go. So in terms of the different options that we talked about for potentially, benefiting or that we could do during this time, probably one of the things I saw most mentioned on the forum was tax loss harvesting. And so for folks who aren't so familiar with that, so tax loss harvesting is an approach where you sell investments at a loss. And while that might seem counterintuitive, the reason behind this is, with the IRS and your taxes, it reduces your tax liability for that year. It also can be used to offset capital gains that you have. So if you are selling stocks that have made gains, tax loss harvesting can minimize those capital gains, the tax that you pay on those capital gains. You can also offset up to $3,000 in non-investment income. And that's, essentially saying that you have the potential to deduct up to that much money in terms of your taxable income, which can be a significant amount. The caveat to tax loss harvesting is you can't really purchase or buy substantially identical stocks within 30 days of the time that you make that sale, which is called a wash sale. And that's when you sell one stock and then buy. And so in order to avoid that, you need to sell a stock and buy a non-substantially identical stock, but a similar stock at the same time. There's some grayness to this. And this will make a little more sense when I kind of go through an example. So for like tax loss harvesting, for instance, this is just a kind of more generic example. Say you bought $1,000 of general index fund back in 2016. And that stock has lost money over time. It's now worth $500. So what you could do is sell that stock at a loss and then buy a similar but not identical stock. And so here you're seeing, this is off the Boglehead website, a stock that is similar but it doesn't have the exact same percentages or the same types of stocks necessarily included in them. And so you could buy that similar type of stock so that you're following the market similarly, but it's different enough that you're not running to the wash sale rules. And then that $500 difference can be used to deduct from your taxable income. Now you also need to make sure that you're turning off reinvestments of the stocks that you're selling in the taxable accounts. And some folks also say even like the tax deferred accounts as well, depending on your level of tolerance and kind of worry about the rules. There's some grayness there, obviously. And that's kind of a general thing to keep in mind. But I think for some folks, this definitely could be a potential thing. I think for a lot of stocks in my portfolio, at least, they definitely have lost some money, even though I've had them for some time. And tax loss harvesting is an option for those individuals. Another thing that could be done, and I saw mentioned maybe less so, was taking advantage of lower interest rates. And this is kind of just like looking at the kind of graph of different interest rates for mortgage. And you can see that they are lower more recently. Refinancing is something that folks sometimes do, and so that might be an option for you if that's a concern. The other thing is reducing 401k distributions. So a couple of things here. One thing is obviously if you're at this time not needing to use as much because we are all staying indoors and we're not sort of going out as much as we did during times of coronavirus, then our expenses are decreased. So then we may not need to have as much from the 401k if you're in retirement and getting distributions from that. The other thing is, during periods of recession, 401k distributions take more out of your portfolio than they would typically, percentage-wise, than they would during times that it's not a recession or at least a decrease in the stock market. So it now might be like a more expensive time overall because there is a larger portion of your market that is going down. Sorry. Question. Okay. Yeah, and that would also, Glenn's point out, that also applied to IRAs and RMDs as well. And that's definitely true. Another factor that folks have pointed out, and this really probably is more so if you're in the accumulation phase and you're not quite in retirement yet, is in determining like your emergency fund allocation. So I think usually what folks say is, more conservatively, 6 months to a year, less conservatively, 3 to 6 months that you have an emergency fund. Essentially, an emergency fund is something that's a stopgap in case you're not able to work. Right now, a lot of folks I think might be out of that position for a little bit longer time, and it's sort of unclear. And so I think that's something to think about if you have investments. Is that a possibility to reallocate to emergency fund if you need to? Ideally, you want to prevent the liquidation of investments that are at a loss and ensure financial stability. If you're in a job also that might not be viable in a few years, or due to the CARES Act or things like that, you might have income now but not going forwards. That might be a consideration too. Things that go into emergency fund determination, there's obviously the essentials: electricity, heat, water, your rent, mortgage payments, car payments, food, insurance and debt. There are also like non-essential things that, discretionary income that might not be as applicable now, and you might not need as much of an emergency fund. So that's something to take into account too. And those just include, things like entertainment costs when you're going out to restaurants, shopping, savings. And so that's one way to calculate it, sort of based on your total expenditures, based on essentials and non-essentials, and seeing what you can sort of cut out and how much you might need. Another way to do it is really just to look at your average monthly budget, and seeing how much you are spending per month, and then sort of allocate that across a given time frame, whether it's 3 months to a year. But I think that's kind of something that folks have been thinking about, or at least talking about, given the times. Another thing that folks did mention a lot in the forum was rebalancing, and how to sort of determine that, and especially, is now a good time to rebalance. I think the general consensus that I saw in the forum was, really you should rebalance whatever based on your IPS, not really based on the times that are going on. And so what exactly is rebalancing? Maybe I should explain that first. But rebalancing involves, changing your asset classes to match your IPS based on predetermined thresholds. Asset classes being, your allocation between, equities, bonds, cash, international, domestic. And there's a couple different ways of doing that. You can determine when you're going to change what percentage you want in whatever category based on a certain date of the year. Folks have also done it based off, an absolute percentage. If it's like 50% of stocks, then just going to keep 50% of stocks in a certain fund. We also do based off relative percentage. Within a given asset class, you could have a relative percentage of international, domestic, and then have that stocks be just a general percentage that you have like 50% of your overall distribution. There are also just dollar amount. Some folks do say like, I'm going to invest a certain amount of money in a given asset class. That's less common from what I've seen. And then the other way you can do it is like via contributions. So you can rebalance based on if you are adding money into a given asset class. That's a way to sort of change the asset allocation, but you're not really moving money between different asset classes. You're just adding money to a certain asset class. Another way, if this does seem overly complicated, or you have concerns that you can't do this accurately, is using target date funds, which automatically can sort of rebalance for you over the years, really more over the long term. I didn't mention it on here, but there are things like Betterment and services like that do rebalancing on a more frequent basis. They do involve a fee though, so I think it really depends on the person whether that's going to be a benefit or not a benefit. And so the idea with rebalancing is, to reduce risk, and also to try to improve the potential returns that you're having. And so here you can kind of see just an example of the effects of rebalancing and what that did over time. And I think you do see that rebalancing, there is a benefit to that. The frequency of rebalancing definitely comes into play, and there's a lot of discussions about this often. I think the general consensus that I've seen is that rebalancing every once in a while is good, and too frequently maybe is not so good. And so usually 6 months to 1 year is kind of generally what I've seen, or based on some of the other metrics that we talked about before. The other thing that I saw mentioned, and maybe not as much, but I thought it was an interesting and potentially a good idea, was setting up a HELOC. And so it's like a home equity line of credit. And the reason for this, I think, was more so, if there was concerns that, you would be out of work or that you wouldn't be able to have enough funds going forward, and you wanted to make sure that was available if you didn't have money in the future. And so basically you're buying line of credit based on equity in your home. And it works somewhat like a credit card, and you have some flexibility in terms of you can borrow the money up to whatever limit, as long as it's allowed by the lender, and then pay it back with interest. And you definitely can sort of withdraw and make payments based on a more easier schedule, I think, than other folks have mentioned to other times. Oh, Laura mentions, but you can't get a HELOC during turbulent times. And I'm not as familiar with the HELOC, so maybe in the discussion, folks can probably talk about that a little bit more. Yeah, because I have not gotten a HELOC, so I can't really speak to actually about that. So yeah, maybe that's a good question for discussion. Okay. The other thing that I saw mentioned was just reviewing the your will and trust. And I thought that is a thing that a lot of folks hadn't done, but especially with coronavirus and the obviously implications for like life and folks passing away from it at such high rates. I think that's something that people maybe have been thinking about a little bit more. And the stats were pretty interesting, which I'll go over in a second. But just to kind of break this down, and I feel like I sort of knew this, but I didn't really have a concrete understanding of it. A will is just a legal document saying, here's how I'm going to distribute my assets after death. And it's relatively easy, costs less than $500 with a lawyer, or you can do it online. A living will is more so for your wishes for medical care if you are incapacitated and you can't make the determinations regarding your medical care. And then a living trust is when you are alive, but your assets are put in a trust and managed by someone and then transferred to whoever you designate after passing away. And those are kind of the discriminations between those. I think most folks have a will. Most folks don't have a living trust because it's more complicated. And usually if you have more assets is when that's more applicable. And I was surprised by this. So folks without a will or living trust, so age 72 or older, about 20% of folks don't have that, which is to me a very surprising amount. And even like, ages 18 to 36, about 80%. And, given kind of the cost and the potential benefits and the level of like confusion that it could clear up if you did unfortunately pass away, it seems like this would be something worth doing if it's not something that you've done already. So there were some more things that we talked about that were more questionable, and maybe things for the discussion too, like when might be a good idea or not a good idea for this. So adjusting your IPS, that might be done now to increase stock allocation when stocks are down now. As we discussed before, though, you really don't know, when is the best time to really invest. Is the market going to go down further, or is it going to increase? I think those things are a bit unclear, and we don't have the best ability to predict those. And I think that's why folks sort of lean away from that. Related to that, obviously, switching from to equities from cash and bond positions for the same reasons. And also diverting reinvestments for cash. This is one that, I think if you do have a lot of stocks and you realize that you do need to increase your emergency fund because of things going on, this might be an option. So I realized I've been talking a lot about the IPS and didn't really explain too much earlier, and probably should have done this a little earlier. But IPS is your investment policy statement. So the idea is it's a predetermined written guideline on your asset allocation and investment time frame. The reasons for having IPS, and I think when I first heard about it, I didn't really see the point, but I think having had it for some time, it's been more, it's helped me understand a little more. It keeps you from being emotional in investment decisions. Buying a lot of stock when the market could go either up or down, or vice versa, selling, when the market is down. And I think a lot of times, we'd like to be rational in these situations, but it's a little difficult to be rational when you do see you're a lot of money being lost or a lot of money being gained, and you're like, oh, well, maybe I should invest more. I think IPS sort of keeps you beholden to a certain asset allocation. The other thing is it reduces investor biases, and there's a video that folks can watch afterwards if they want to. But I think it reduces the chance that you're going to be susceptible to things like risk aversion, where you're worried about losing money, so you're more hesitant to invest in things when things aren't going as well. And your IPS can be as simple as saying, here's my asset allocation. It's going to be 54% domestic funds, 30% international, 6% bonds, rebalance every June. And that's kind of an easy way to do it, and something that's very simple. Oh, and I saw a question, but then I lost it somehow. So we can discuss at the end if folks are okay with that. Other things that were, I think, a little more questionable, and I think depend on the situation. One is like selling things to invest in the market, just selling like your properties, or even selling like your goods or cars or things like that. This might be done so you can, buy low, but also wonders like, if this is something that you were okay doing, why wasn't this done before? Because oftentimes we say is time in the market is greater than market timing, and having the funds in the market for longer is probably more likely to yield something than trying to figure out when's the best time to invest funds. The other thing that we sort of discussed on touch base a little earlier is, IRA to Roth conversions. The reason you might do this is, you have probably a lower balance in your IRA or a 401k at this time. And so converting to a Roth might be a good time because you'll pay fewer taxes on those. Obviously this changes your asset allocation though. So that is something to keep in mind. Oh, oh, and then Laura's saying IRA to Roth does not change your asset allocation. Oh, okay. Well, I was thinking it might change it if you only have like one given set of funds in the IRA. For instance, if you have all like international or domestic, then it could potentially change it down the line depending on your withdrawal rates in retirement. But maybe Laura can speak to that more whenever we have the discussion if I'm wrong on that. Actually, she might. Yeah, we can definitely. Okay. So bad options. I think we sort of talked about this earlier. Selling stocks because of the fear of the market falling. I think we kind of recognize that you want to buy low and sell high, and now is probably not time to sell stocks. If you really need to, and that's sort of like a last option and not something that's preferable. I did just look this up briefly because I was interested, and this has been talked about somewhat on the forum as well. The CARES Act, really the act looking at trying to reinstate and help folks who are struggling due to the coronavirus, and making some changes in different things. The recovery rebate for folks who meet certain income qualifications, which is I think already been distributed for pretty much everyone. They're also they have waived the 10% early withdrawal penalty for like retirement accounts, and that's something to consider. Being able to deduct up to $300 for charitable deductions without itemizing, and then not having a limit for for charitable deductions, which is usually 50% of your adjusted gross income. And then there's also benefits for student loans and small businesses. And then Moshi was mentioning, okay. And I think it's probably more out to discussion. We can definitely talk about it in discussion. Okay.